It's strange, isn't it? How easy it is to disappear without anyone noticing. Not in the dramatic way. Not running away, not hiding out. I mean something quieter. Like the way your voice thins out when you're surrounded. The way your posture shifts just slightly when you step into a full room. The way your thoughts pause, recalibrate when too many eyes are nearby. Maybe you've felt it. That subtle flicker inside, like a match about to go out. Or maybe like it's been replaced by something else entirely. You laugh when they laugh, even if the joke's not funny. You nod along, even when something in you hesitates. You look around before you speak, just to check the wind. And it's not weakness, it's not fear even, it's older than that. There was a night years ago walking home after a protest. One of those slow, angry ones, full of chants and handmade signs. Everyone packed tight, spilling into the street like floodwater. There was a girl next to me I didn't know. She had tears in her eyes, but she wasn't crying. I remember that detail, how still her face was. Someone started shouting, not angry shouting. Rhythmic, commanding, the kind that hits your bones before your ears. And I felt it. My feet moving just half a second behind the voice. Not from choice, not really. More like gravity. We all surged together, this heaving pulse of warm bodies and heat and noise. And I swear, for maybe 30 seconds, I couldn't find myself. Not in a poetic way. I mean, I actually had the thought, where did I go? And maybe that's when it really settled in. This idea that who you are, it's not fixed. It bends. It folds. It dissolves. Given the right crowd and the right timing. The creepy part? It didn't feel wrong. It felt kind of beautiful. But also afterward embarrassing. Like waking up from a dream where you were dancing naked in public. Not horrifying, just exposed. You wonder what took over. You wonder how much of that was you. That's what gets me. Not that we change in crowds, but how natural it feels when we do. And I don't mean big mobs or political rallies. I mean the tiny, invisible ones. The way your tone shifts in group chats. The way you dress differently depending on the friend group. The way silence feels heavier when others are present. You don't notice when it starts. The bleed between self and collective is not dramatic, not sudden, but it's there. Like fog creeping under a door. And the people around you, they don't ask for it. They don't have to. Because your brain is already listening. Already scanning for the social signals, the unspoken norms. The cues that whisper, don't stand out. Don't slow us down. Don't break the rhythm. And somewhere deep down, older than reason, you obey. Not because you're weak, but because you were built that way. That thought used to scare me. I used to think of the self as sacred, like a lighthouse that couldn't be moved. But it's more like a candle, and crowds are wind. Sometimes gentle, sometimes violent, but always changing the shape of the flame. There's this weird guilt that follows too, like when you leave the group and your voice feels foreign in your own throat. Or when you replay a conversation and realize you didn't really mean most of what you said. You just wanted to stay in tune. And the line between belonging and erasure? It's thinner than we like to admit. You don't just go along to fit in. Sometimes you go along because the group feels safer than yourself. That's the part nobody says out loud. That sometimes losing yourself feels like a kind of relief. Because being a self is exhausting. Holding the line, making the call, standing still when everything around you moves. That's work. And the crowd offers a break, a trance, a place to float. But what happens when you float too long? When you forget where your feet are supposed to be? That's what I want to talk about. Not in a lecture, not in a neat little package. Just sit with it for a bit. The way your voice shifts in groups. The way your memories of certain moments feel foggy, like they weren't entirely yours. The way sometimes, in the quiet after a gathering, there's a hollow ringing in your chest, like you gave something up. And you're not sure what. I don't have answers. I'm not here to fix it. But if you've ever felt that quiet unraveling, that moment when the I in you starts slipping away, then maybe we can walk through this together. Not to reclaim some lost purity, not to build walls around our identities, just to notice, to remember that even in the warmth of togetherness, there's a cost, and that the cost is paid, first and quietly, by the part of you that says, I know who I am. Till one day you whisper back, do I? Let's stay with that. Not run from it, not fix it. Just stay and see where it leads. I used to think identity was like a sculpture, something you slowly carved over time. You chip away what doesn't belong, you refine the edges, and eventually you stand back and say, yeah, that's me. But now I think it's more like water. It takes the shape of whatever's around it. And I don't mean that in some poetic, self-empowering way. I mean literally. Your sense of who you are shifts. Constantly. Not because you're fake, not because you're lost, but because your brain never stops negotiating between the I and the us. The version of you that shows up when you're with your parents, different from the one that shows up at work, or with old friends, or when you're alone in your car at night singing to nobody. That last one, that version almost never gets seen. And you know what's wild? That version might not even be the most real either, just less edited. It's easy to imagine we each have a true core, something untouched and unchanging. But what if that idea is just comforting fiction? A story we tell ourselves to feel stable in a world that's always moving? You hear things like, be yourself all the time, as if yourself is some static blueprint. But what if the blueprint is actually a living document, constantly rewritten by context, crowd, memory, and need? Think about how many of your beliefs are inherited. Not chosen, just absorbed. From school, family, TV, TikTok, a passing comment by a teacher you barely remember. It doesn't feel like theft, it feels like growth. But then one day, you try to trace an idea you hold dearly back to its source, and you realize you don't know where it came from. It's just there. Like a watermark you didn't notice being stamped. We're built to mirror. That's how babies learn to smile. That's how tribes used to coordinate their survival. Mirroring was safety. Fitting in was life. And not fitting in? Exile. Which back then was basically death. So your brain still carries that echo. Still treats social rejection like an existential threat, even in a Starbucks line. You can be the most self-aware person in the world, but put you in a group that believes something, strongly, loudly, and watch how fast your own convictions begin to sway, even if just a little. You probably won't even notice it happening. The shift is microscopic, almost elegant in how quietly it enters. A gesture here, a silence there. And soon enough, you're nodding, not because you agree, but because agreement feels warmer than friction. And sometimes that's fine. We're social animals. But other times, it's how people lose themselves, one compromise at a time. The scariest part? The crowd doesn't take your identity. You give it, willingly. Because it feels easier. Because it's quieter than resistance. We're not taught to sit with contradiction. We're taught to resolve it, clean it up, pick a side. But maybe the most honest moments are the ones where we admit, I don't fully know what I think. And that uncertainty? That's the real you too. The version that isn't streamlined for acceptance. It's funny. The people who seem the most themselves are often the ones who've stopped trying to lock down who they are. They just let themselves be a little blurry. Not vague, just open. But that openness, it makes you vulnerable, especially in groups, because the crowd doesn't love ambiguity. The crowd loves certainty, loudness, echoes. The moment you hesitate, the moment you say, I'm not sure, the crowd either pulls you in harder or pushes you out. So we adapt. We sand down the rough edges. We find the acceptable version of ourselves, and we wear it like a second skin. And then we forget we're even wearing it? You ever have that feeling leaving a gathering where you're just kind of buzzing, but not in a good way? More like you've been stretched too thin. You said things, laughed at things, stayed quiet when you should have said something. And now your body feels off, like it's trying to recalibrate. That's not social fatigue. That's identity hangover. But again, this isn't failure. This is function. This is how humans were designed to survive, to cooperate, to belong. The group makes the rules and you follow them. Not because you're spineless, but because deep down, part of you believes, if I don't, I won't make it. That's the illusion. That your self is a single clear signal. In reality, it's a radio dial that never stops adjusting to the station that feels safest. And maybe that's okay. Maybe fluidity is honest. Maybe this need we have for fixed identities, brand statements, personality tests, online bios, it's just our way of pretending we're not scared of how malleable we really are. But you should know this. Crowds know that truth. And so do those who use crowds to steer things. Politicians, influencers, marketers, cult leaders, even well-meaning activists. They don't need to convince you. They just need the group to believe. Once the group does, you'll drift toward it like a leaf toward a river. Not because you're weak, because you're wired for it. You're optimized for togetherness, but sometimes that togetherness asks for pieces of you didn't mean to give. And by the time you notice, the cost has already been paid. I don't say any of this as a warning. More like a confession, a reminder that the I you believe in is real, yes, but only in motion, only in context, only in contrast. You are real, but you are not fixed. And when you find yourself feeling off, feeling distant from your own voice, maybe pause. Not to resist the group, but to remember the weight of being a self. It's not always easy, but it's yours, at least for now. There's a kind of silence that only happens in a loud place. Like when you're in the middle of a packed stadium or a protest or a nightclub, somewhere noisy, wild, and suddenly you realize you're not thinking anymore. You're reacting, moving, shouting, laughing. But not really from your own script. Something else is steering, and for a little while it feels good to let go of the wheel. That's deindividuation. Not a fancy term, not some academic invention to sound clever. It's just the name we gave to what happens when the lines around you blur. Not just between people, but between thought and impulse. Between self-awareness and group rhythm. Between me and them. Zimbardo tried to map it out. You've probably heard of him, Stanford prison experiment guy. But before all that, he dug into what makes people act out of character in groups. His early work showed that people wearing masks, or even just uniforms that stripped away identity, became far more likely to act in extreme ways. Cruelty, aggression, recklessness, not because they were secretly bad, but because something had been turned off. Not shut down, just turned down. Like a dimmer switch on guilt. And it's not limited to extreme cases. This happens on a daily basis, quietly in spaces that don't feel dangerous at all. Look at comment sections. Look at fan mobs outside concert venues. Look at bachelorette parties in Vegas. Anytime there's anonymity, a loss of consequence, or a shared emotional current, there's a doorway. And it doesn't take much to walk through. It's not that you stop being you. It's more like the accountability tether gets cut. That inner voice that normally says, "That's not me," gets muffled by the chorus of, "This is what we do." The crowd doesn't force you to change. It gives you permission. The hard part is most people don't even notice it happening because it doesn't always feel chaotic. Sometimes it feels electric, freeing, like you're finally unshackled from all the little rules you carry alone. And for a while, maybe that's true. But freedom without self-recognition? That's not agency. That's drift. There's a clip I saw once, footage from the 2011 London riots. A guy, young, maybe 20s, was looting a convenience store. Nothing brutal, no violence, just arms full of stolen snacks. A reporter stopped him afterward and asked why. He didn't even try to justify it, just said, "Everyone was doing it. Felt like normal." Felt like normal. That's the haunting part, not the theft. The fact that it didn't feel wrong in the moment. It felt ambient. Like the group had redefined right and wrong in real time, and he just went along with the new rules. There's a protective layer we wear when we're alone. Call it reflection, call it inhibition, call it your conscience. But in a group, that layer thins. Not because you want to lose it, but because the group has its own weather system. And after a while, you just stop bringing an umbrella. People imagine that mobs are made of monsters. They're not. They're made of regular people, temporarily unanchored from themselves. That's all it takes. And I think part of why it's so effective, why de-individuation happens so fast, is because it feels ancient. Like some evolutionary muscle memory. We've been syncing ourselves to the rhythm of groups for tens of thousands of years. It's how tribes survived, how soldiers marched, how revolutions rose. It's built in. But what was once about survival can now be exploited. When a crowd chants in unison, that's not just noise. That's neurological entrainment. Your heartbeat literally starts to sync. Your adrenaline goes up. Your sense of space changes. You don't feel like one person anymore. You feel like part of something. Bigger, stronger, louder. And it's intoxicating. The line between empowerment and erasure gets thin there. Because while you're swept up in that momentum, the individual parts of you that might normally resist, your doubt, your ethics, your quieter instincts, get drowned out. They're not erased, just outvoted. I used to think strength meant standing your ground, holding fast to your own mind in the middle of a crowd. But sometimes strength is knowing when the crowd has replaced your mind altogether, and finding a way back. Even if it's just with a whisper, there's a weird loneliness that hits after group moments like that. Like a social hangover. You come back into yourself and realize how far you drifted. You remember things you said, things you let slide, things you cheered for but didn't mean. And you wonder, would I have done that if I'd been alone? The answer almost doesn't matter. What matters is that the group made you feel like the question wasn't relevant. And here's the kicker. Most of the time, it's not violent or awful or dark. Sometimes de-individuation leads to beautiful things. Spontaneous dance circles, collective mourning, singing together in a crowd of strangers. Those moments matter too, but the mechanism is the same. The self thins. The group fills in the gaps. So the question isn't, is this good or bad? It's, am I still here? Not physically, not in the selfie, but consciously, intact, present. That's the tension. That's what de-individuation forces us to confront. Not the fear of turning into someone else, but the realization of how easy it is to forget who you were, just for a little while. And maybe that's why we come back to these moments again and again. Not because we like losing ourselves, but because sometimes it's the only way to feel part of something bigger. And that need, it runs deep. So maybe it's not about rejecting the crowd. Maybe it's about walking into it with your eyes open, knowing the rules of the game and watching carefully for the moment when your hands are moving before your thoughts catch up. That moment, that's where it starts. Not with chaos, not with fury, but with quiet agreement. And if you can catch that, even just one, you're already ahead. You ever notice how hard it is to say something unpopular, even if it's true? I don't mean shouting something edgy for attention. I mean those small moments, like when you're in a group and someone says something a little off and everyone laughs or nods and you just sit there, still. Not because you agree, but because saying something would mean stepping outside the warmth of that moment. That warmth, by the way, that's the trap. It's not just peer pressure in the cartoonish, come on, everyone's doing it kind of way. It's way more subtle than that. It's a heat you don't want to lose, a belonging you don't want to threaten. And your brain knows it, even before you do. That's what Asch figured out. Solomon Asch, back in the 50s, ran a study where he asked people to compare the lengths of lines. Simple stuff. Just look and say which line is longest. But here's the twist. Everyone else in the room was in on it. They'd all give the wrong answer, on purpose. And the subject, the only real participant, would go last. Over and over, people gave the wrong answer. Not because they were blind, but because the group said so. That's not stupidity. That's survival instinct. What Asch showed is that people don't need threats or bribes to conform. They just need a room full of confidence, and maybe a fear of being alone. And we like to think, well, I wouldn't fall for that. But honestly, you probably already have. In school, in meetings, at dinner tables, on social media, you've nodded when you didn't agree. You've clapped when you didn't care. You've stayed silent because silence felt safer than honesty. And again, this isn't failure. This is what being human looks like when you're surrounded by other humans. We weren't designed to live as islands. We're pack animals with language. And the pack has rules. The most dangerous one? Agreement equals safety. We think we're reasoning. We think we're making independent choices. But half the time, we're scanning the room first. We're checking which way the wind is blowing before we decide what we believe. The problem is, sometimes the wind is lying. Think about history for a second. Real history. Not the stuff with quotes and flags, but the quiet moments before the big ones. Before regimes rose. Before cults formed. Before genocides began. There were always rooms full of people who knew something was off, who felt it in their guts. But they looked around and no one else was speaking. So they didn't either. It's not that they didn't care. It's that they didn't want to be first. There's a cost to dissent. Not always physical, but social, emotional. Existential. People fear being the one who ruins the vibe, the one who makes it awkward, the one who says, hey, I don't think this is okay when everyone else is laughing. That fear runs deeper than we think. Runs. I remember this time in college. We were in a discussion group talking about ethics or politics or something heavy like that. And one guy made a comment. Harmless on the surface, but if you listen closely, there was something gross underneath. Not a slur. Just a quiet dismissal of real pain. And the room went still. Then someone chuckled. Then a few nods. The moment moved on. And I just sat there. I still think about that silence. Not his words. Mine. The ones I didn't speak. Because I didn't want to be the guy who overreacted. Who killed the mood. Who made it about me. I wanted to stay in the group more than I wanted to be honest. And that's how it happens. Not through evil. Through comfort. Through the path of least resistance. Sometimes the lie that keeps the peace feels kinder than the truth that breaks it. But over time, that trade-off eats away at you. You get good at blending, at reading the room, at knowing when to smile and when to stay out of it. But something inside starts to blur. You lose track of where your thoughts end and the group's expectations begin. And here's the twist. Every group believes it's the one telling the truth. The righteous crowd, the good crowd, the brave ones. So, when you dissent, you're not just wrong, you're dangerous. You're a threat to the illusion, the narrative, the identity. So, yeah, the cost of dissent? It's not always exile, sometimes it's mockery, sometimes it's a look, sometimes it's a silence so sharp it cuts deeper than words ever could. And knowing that, your brain adapts. It edits. It calibrates. It learns to predict which thoughts are safe and which are too much. Which jokes land and which get you labeled. Which truths you can speak and which you bury so deep you forget you ever held them. And you do it all without thinking, without malice, without even realizing it, till one day you look back at a conversation and think, why didn't I say anything? And you won't like the answer. But maybe the real danger isn't in the moments we stay quiet. Maybe it's in the slow erosion that silence leaves behind, the hollowing out of self, the small daily betrayals that build into something you don't recognize. And maybe the first step isn't shouting from rooftops or arguing online. Maybe it's just noticing. The twitch in your stomach when something feels wrong. The flicker in your chest when you want to speak and don't. Maybe it's letting yourself feel the tension of not belonging, just for a second, and seeing what part of you still survives there. Because conformity isn't always about belief. Sometimes it's just about fear. The fear of being alone in what you see. The fear of being the only one clapping offbeat. But if you're lucky, if you hold still long enough, you might hear another pair of hands. Somewhere clapping offbeat too. And maybe that's all it takes. Not a revolution. Just a few people willing to sound wrong at first. To be honest, before it's safe. There's this thing that happens when something bad goes down in public. A person collapses, someone screams for help. A fight breaks out in the street, and you're there, right there. Not watching it on a screen, not reading about it later. You're in it. And still, you freeze. You tell yourself you're confused, you're unsure, you don't know what to do. But deep down, something colder kicks in. This voice that says, someone else will handle it. And in that one moment where urgency should light a fire in your chest, it just doesn't. You feel that. That's the diffusion of responsibility. It sounds sterile when you phrase it like that, like a lab result. But really, it's one of the eeriest instincts we carry. And the worst part? It feels so reasonable in the moment. Like you're not helping. You're just waiting, just in case. Watching. Letting someone more qualified, more confident, more sure of what's happening take the lead. But often, nobody does. That's what Darley and Latani were trying to understand back in the late 60s. After the murder of Kitty Genovese, a woman attacked in New York while dozens of people reportedly did nothing, they asked the question that still makes your stomach turn. Why didn't anyone help? So they ran studies, set up fake emergencies, had someone pretend to choke in a nearby room, and then they watched. And what they found was brutal. The more people there were around, the less likely anyone was to intervene. You'd think more eyes would mean more help, but no. More people meant more diffusion, more spreading of the weight, more hands shrugging at the same time. It's like the responsibility gets vaporized into the crowd. Everyone assumes someone else is closer, someone else is better equipped, someone else will make the move. And you know what that makes you? Not evil, not heartless, just human. Disappointingly, heartbreakingly human. Because we're not trained to lead in chaos. We're trained to look around, to follow cues, to wait for signals. And if everyone's waiting, that silence becomes its own instruction. The weirdest part? You probably won't even remember choosing not to act. Your brain will cover it over with 1,000 little rationalizations. I didn't understand what was happening. It looked like they were okay. There were already people there. It'll smooth it out until it feels like nothing happened at all. But something did. A choice was made. Not just by you, but by the crowd. Or rather, not made. Because when everyone waits, nobody moves. And this doesn't just apply to emergencies. That same diffusion shows up in offices, in group projects, in online mobs, in protests, in family dynamics. Anytime there's a shared space and a shared expectation, there's the risk that responsibility slips through the cracks. Ever been in a meeting where something unethical was said and no one challenged it? You all kind of shifted in your seats, waiting to see who'd speak up, and when no one did, it just passed. The silence became consent, and afterward you probably thought, someone should have said something, without realizing you were someone. That realization stings, because it means you're not as separate from the problem as you thought. You were a part of the mechanism that let it happen. But here's where it gets trickier. Because we want to believe we'd be the exception, that we'd be the one who rushes in, the one who speaks up, the one who makes the difference. And maybe you have been. Maybe once or twice you broke the pattern. But even then, it's rarely a bold cinematic moment. It's usually clumsy, hesitant. You move before you're ready. Your voice cracks, your legs shake, and afterward you doubt yourself. And still, it mattered. Because the moment someone acts, the whole structure shifts. That single move breaks the spell. It makes everyone else realize, oh, I can do something too. The crowd's inertia collapses and suddenly people move. It's like lighting a fuse, but getting to that point? That's hard. Because the cost of acting alone, of being the first, is heavy. You risk embarrassment, failure, backlash. So we stall. We hesitate. And often that delay is all it takes for the moment to slip away. And again, you're not broken for doing this. You're normal. You're a part of a species that spent most of its existence surviving in packs. Packs that relied on signals, not individual action. Packs where stepping out of line wasn't noble. It was dangerous. So your brain evolved to read the room first, to wait for consensus, to protect itself. But in a world where danger looks different, where harm can happen in full view of 100 frozen witnesses, that instinct backfires. And you don't need to be a hero to push against it. Sometimes all it takes is a step, a word, a flicker of movement that says, I saw that. I won't wait. That's enough to change the script. Not always, but sometimes. And in a world where silence is the default, sometimes it's powerful. There's this quiet lie that crowds whisper, you're not responsible. You're just here. But that's not true. Presence is responsibility. Witnessing is participation. Even if you do nothing, you were there. That counts for something. So maybe the challenge isn't to always act. That's not realistic. We freeze. We miss things. We get it wrong. But maybe the challenge is to catch that moment when you feel yourself waiting and question it. Am I waiting because I need more information? Or am I just hoping someone else will go first? If it's the second one, maybe that's your signal. Not to be perfect, just to be human in a different way. The kind that moves first, even with shaky hands, even when no one else is. Because that ripple you start, it might be invisible, but it's real. It breaks the math of diffusion. It reminds the crowd that someone still sees, still feels, still chooses. And that's enough to rewrite the ending. There's a kind of magic, dangerous magic, that happens when you're standing in a crowd and something starts to shift in the air. Not the weather, the mood. A spark of joy or panic or rage. And suddenly it's not just one person feeling it, it's all of you. At once. That's emotional contagion. And it's not poetic. It's literal. Your body, your nervous system, is wired to catch feelings like a virus. This isn't some metaphor about vibes. This is about mirror neurons, about facial expressions triggering mirrored responses in the brain, about the way someone else's fear can literally change your heartbeat, your breathing, your blood pressure. It's old, pre-verbal, ancient circuitry doing exactly what it evolved to do. Synchronize you with your tribe. We forget how physical emotions really are. We say things like, you could feel the tension in the room, as if it's just an expression, but it's not. Your brain picks up microsignals, tiny changes in tone, posture, blink rate, muscle tension, and it reacts. Before you're even aware. You ever walked into a room after a fight and just knew? That's not intuition. That's pattern recognition on a biological level. And it works both ways. Joy too. The way one person laughing, really laughing, can set off a ripple that turns into a wave. And suddenly you're laughing too, even if you missed the joke. It's contagious, because we're not meant to feel alone. But that contagion? It's neutral. It doesn't care what the emotion is. And when the dominant emotion is panic, it spreads just as fast, maybe faster. Picture a crowd at a concert. Something crashes, loud. Just a speaker falling over maybe. But one person flinches, someone else gasps, a third bolts, and within seconds you've got a stampede. Not because anyone knows what happened, but because fear beat facts to the punch. And by the time the truth catches up, the damage is done. This is how riots start, how markets crash, how revolutions ignite, how bad decisions get dressed up in adrenaline and group approval, and sprint past the part of your brain that's supposed to say, wait. And the scariest part is, it feels so real in the moment. The emotion isn't fake. Your body is really responding. You really do feel the anger, or the dread, or the euphoria. And that reality convinces you that the reaction is justified. But what if it's not? What if you're just standing too close to someone else's emotional fire? Think about sports crowds, the euphoria of a last-minute goal, the way strangers high-five like old friends. That's emotional contagion in its most beautiful form. For a moment, all differences dissolve. You're just humans, in sync, high on the same chemical flood. But it cuts both ways. Think about mob violence, or war rallies. Think about how fast anger can catch fire when it's allowed to go unchallenged. All it takes is a spark. One person throwing something. One voice shouting something brutal. And then suddenly it's not a person doing that, it's us. And us feels untouchable. Because that's the lie the crowd tells you. That you're safe in numbers. That the rules don't apply when everyone's doing it. That the feeling must be right because it's so loud. But emotion, when it spreads like that, doesn't just change what you do. It rewires what you believe is true. There were experiments, Hatfield and others, where participants would unconsciously mirror the expressions of people they were exposed to. If someone smiled at them long enough, they started to feel happier. If someone looked anxious, their own stress markers would rise. No words exchanged. Just face-to-face, signal and response. Now take that and multiply it by 1,000 people. A stadium, a protest, a blackout city street full of sirens. And imagine what happens to your body when that flood hits. You can't outthink it. You can't logic your way past a limbic system on fire. That's the cruel part. Even if you know what's happening, you still feel it. Your brain has two tracks. The fast, ancient one that reacts, and the slower thinking one that analyzes. But in a crowd, the fast one wins. Every time. So you cheer when they cheer, you cry when they cry. You chant things you'd never say alone, and later you might wonder why. You'll say, it just felt right. And that feeling, that warm, electrified rightness, that's what makes emotional contagion so powerful. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't need you to understand. It just needs you to be close enough, open enough. It needs you to belong. Because belonging is the real drug. That's what it's always been about. The emotions aren't the point. They're the delivery system. The real currency is connection, feeling part of something, feeling like you matter. And when the cost is just your independent thought, sometimes that feels like a bargain, but it's a dangerous one. Because once emotion overrides reflection, the crowd becomes something else. not just a group of people, a body, a force, a single will with no brakes. You can see it in political rallies, religious fervor, flash mobs, panic buying at grocery stores. It's not reason driving that movement, it's resonance. And once you're inside, the hardest thing to do is stop. Because pulling back, becoming still in a sea of motion, feels unnatural. Wrong, like betrayal, like failure. But sometimes that's exactly what it takes. One still body, one calm face, one person who doesn't cheer or scream or run. Not to stop the crowd. That's not your job. Just to remember that the crowd is not you. That the emotion might be shared, but the choice? That's still yours, if you can find it. So when you feel yourself rising with the tide, swept up in joy or rage or fear, try this, just for a second. Ask, is this mine? And if it is, own it. Write it, but if it's not, if it's someone else's storm, passed into you by noise and proximity and heat, maybe, just maybe, you don't have to carry it. Maybe you can let it pass. Let it burn around you, not through you. You won't always catch it. Nobody does. But the act of trying, that quiet moment of reflection inside the noise, that's something rare and real. It won't make you immune, but it might make you human again, even in a crowd that's forgotten how. There's something weirdly ancient about crowds. Like once you're in one, part of your brain thinks you've stepped back in time. Not just a few decades, millennia. As if the rules of civilization start slipping and something older, hungrier, simpler starts to take over. It's not a metaphor. Le Bon called it regression. Said people in crowds often revert to a more primitive mental state. Emotional, impulsive, suggestible. And the more I think about it, the more it checks out. The crowd doesn't just change your behavior, it messes with time, with memory, with who you think you are. Because crowds don't care about nuance. They don't want your second thoughts. They want speed, unity, volume. And your brain? It's surprisingly eager to give those things. There's this part of your brain, the amygdala, that gets a lot of press when we talk about fear. But it's not just about fear. It's about quick decisions, immediate survival, fight, flight, freeze. That part lights up fast, and in crowds, it stays lit. You know that electric buzzing feeling in your skin when you're packed shoulder to shoulder with people, even if nothing's wrong? That's your body saying, heads up. This could turn primal real quick. It's not paranoia, it's pattern recognition. From a time when getting surrounded didn't mean concert vibes, it meant predators, or ambushes, or ritual. So when people say a crowd has a mind of its own, it's not poetry, it's literal. The individuals blur, the self-awareness fades, what's left is collective instinct. That's why crowds can feel euphoric one second and terrifying the next. There's no buffer. I saw it once at a festival. Beautiful day. Everyone dancing, singing. Then someone in the middle tripped. That's all, just tripped. But the bodies behind didn't see that. They just saw movement, people falling. And in 5 seconds flat, the music cut and the whole front row was in a panic. Nobody had time to think. That's how fast the body takes over. And the tricky part is, once that primitive brain kicks in, it's not easy to claw your way back out. Your rational mind doesn't shout in those moments. It whispers. And whispers get drowned in 100 pounding hearts. It makes sense, though. Back in tribal times, it was dangerous to be the odd one out. If your group ran, you ran, even if you didn't know why. Stopping to think could get you killed, so the brain learned to follow before understanding, and we still carry that. It's not just physical either, it's moral. You ever seen someone do something awful in a group and then later say, I don't know what came over me? That line? It's not always an excuse. Sometimes it's brutally honest. They really don't know. Because the part of them that would normally veto that action got benched, and the crowd, the collective body, didn't need a veto. It needed momentum. That's the scary truth. The crowd rewards instinct, not thought. And it's easy to feel powerful when you're not alone in your impulses. But power without reflection? That's how things break. Think of stadium fights, or flash mobs turned violent. Think of soldiers and units committing war crimes. Not because they were all monsters, but because once the collective body starts moving, it's hard to remember you were ever an individual. The scariest part is how natural it feels. Because the crowd offers a kind of safety, Not just from others, but from yourself, from doubt, from shame, from hesitation. You get to offload the weight of should I and let the group decide. And groups, they don't ask polite questions. They shout, they demand, they react. It's intoxicating, especially if you're someone who's spent a lifetime second guessing. Suddenly, here's this pulse, this roar, this unity, and it wants you. Not for your thoughts, but your presence, your energy, your surrender. And for a little while, it feels like relief. But when you step away, if you do, it hits. This strange emotional hangover. Not guilt exactly, more like disorientation. Like waking up from a dream where you weren't quite yourself, and now the memory's fuzzy. Like trying to trace your own outline in fog. That's not weakness. That's what happens when the ancient part of you takes the wheel. And you let it. Because maybe you wanted to. Maybe you were tired of being the one who always analyzes everything, who always watches from the sidelines. And in the crowd, you gotta disappear into something larger. I get it. I really do. But that's what makes it dangerous, because once you've felt that surrender, how good it feels to be absorbed, it's tempting to chase it again. To find more moments where you don't have to think, where you just move, shout, agree. And before you know it, that ancient version of you, the one who only survives by syncing to the group, starts becoming your default, your comfort zone. That's where things get blurry, because not all crowds are created equal. Some will lift you, others will chew you up and spit out someone you barely recognize. And in the moment, it's hard to tell the difference. The only defense I've found? Stillness. Not literal, always, but inner stillness. Some part of you that holds on. That keeps a thread tied to who you were before the wave hit. It doesn't have to be loud, just real. Because when the crowd's moving fast, the loudest voices aren't always the wisest. And the most urgent emotions aren't always the most honest. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do in a crowd is pause. Not to resist, not to rebel, just to check, is this me? Or is this just ancient circuitry doing its thing again? You won't always get it right. Nobody does. But even asking that question, especially when everyone else has stopped, that's a kind of power the primitive brain doesn't understand. And that's exactly why it matters. Most people think crowds are messy, chaotic, unpredictable, but that's only half true. Yeah, on the surface, they look wild. Noise, motion, bodies. But underneath, there's a pattern, a rhythm, and anyone who understands it can use it. That's the part we don't talk about enough. The crowd isn't just a stage for emotion, it's also a tool, a structure, something you can build with and steer, push in a direction. Not always directly, not with commands, but with cues, framing, atmosphere, repetition. You don't need to shout to control a crowd, you just need to know how it breathes. And it does breathe, like one giant organism. Inhales of silence, exhales of noise, pauses when uncertain, surges when affirmed. It listens not to logic, but to feeling, to signal, to tone. That's where control begins. Not in the content of what's said, but in the cadence, the familiarity, the emotional payload. It's subtle, surgical sometimes. You've seen it in speeches, not the obvious ones, the flashy demagogue stuff. I mean the quiet manipulation, the way someone will drop a word just enough times for it to nest in your mind. The way a phrase, an image, a symbol gets repeated until it feels like memory. And once it feels like memory, it's yours. Even if it never belonged to you before. You see it in advertising too. In branding, in news cycles, same mechanics, control through familiarity, through rhythm, through placement. A steady drip of emotional hooks until the crowd believes it thought of them first. That's the trick. The best kind of control is invisible. It makes you feel like you're choosing, even when the menu's already been curated. And when it's happening in a crowd, it's even easier. Because individual resistance weakens when shared experience intensifies. One person questions a narrative. They're a skeptic. 10,000 people chant it in unison. It becomes truth. Not because it's been proven, but because it's been absorbed. Control doesn't need truth, it needs coherence. And the human brain? It's addicted to coherence. It wants a clean story more than it wants a messy reality. That's why crowds are so fertile. Once you tap into the emotional current, you don't have to convince. You just have to keep the energy aligned. And there's something else too. Something darker. Crowds don't just make you feel anonymous. They can also make you feel righteous. Like the sheer size of the group validates the cause. If this many people agree, we must be right. That logic, it's ancient, tribal, powerful, and manipulable. Because what feels like righteousness might just be reinforcement. Echoes don't make things true, they just make them louder. You ever wonder why propaganda works best in public spaces? Why chants, flags, uniforms, ceremonies, all that stuff gets used again and again by every system of power? It's because power understands crowds better than most people do. And when you control the cues, you don't have to control the people. They'll steer themselves thinking they're free. It's not just political either, it shows up everywhere. In companies, in fan bases, in cults, in algorithm-driven trends. The goal is the same. Shape behavior by shaping environment. Reward the right cues, punish the wrong ones, and let the crowd do the rest. That's why dissent feels so lonely. Because crowds aren't neutral, they're reactive. And once a norm sets in, whether it's moral or social or stylistic, stepping outside it doesn't just feel risky, it feels wrong. But here's the thing. The ones orchestrating the crowd, they're not always some evil mastermind. Often they're just people who understand the system a little better. People who figured out how to nudge, how to signal, how to press just enough on the right nerve. And most of us, we don't even realize we're being nudged. That's what makes it dangerous. Because the control doesn't feel like a cage, it feels like consensus. You're not being forced, you're being aligned. It's quieter than censorship, louder than silence. It's the story that everyone knows without ever being told, the shared language of approval. And it's not just about what you say, it's about what you don't say, what you don't think. What becomes invisible because the crowd never gave you permission to see it. That kind of control, it doesn't need fences, it builds from within. It reshapes the self, using the crowd as scaffolding. And after enough time, you forget there was ever another shape. That's the part that scares me. Not that we get manipulated, but that we start doing the manipulation ourselves. Subtly, internally. We filter our words, our posts, our opinions, not out of fear, but out of training. Because the crowd teaches. Every silence, every cheer, every shared signal. It all becomes a curriculum, and if you pay attention, you start to see it. Not just around you, but in you. You catch yourself hesitating before you speak. Rephrasing a sentence so it lands right. Choosing the image that gets more likes. Smiling at something you don't believe. Not because you're fake, but because you've learned the rhythm. And stepping out of that rhythm, that's not just weird, it's punished. Sometimes gently. A lost follower, a side eye, a polite unfollow. Other times harder, shaming, mockery, isolation. The crowd has 1,000 ways to tell you, get back in line. So you do. You stay in tempo, you move with the rest, and little by little, the self you used to be, the one who asked too many questions, who liked weird things, who doubted the noise, gets quieter. Not erased, just tucked away. For later, maybe. But what if later never comes? That's the risk. Because every day you stay in that current, you forget what stillness felt like. You forget what your own rhythm sounds like. And one day, the voice in your head that used to say, "This doesn't feel right," is just gone. Replaced by 1,000 smaller voices all saying the same thing. You belong. And belonging feels good, but it's not always worth the price. So here's the hard question, the one I still wrestle with. Are you speaking your mind, or are you just echoing the most approved version of it? You don't have to answer out loud, just don't stop asking. There's this myth we all buy into, whether we say it out loud or not. That deep down, we're meant to be independent, autonomous, self-contained units of thought and agency, making choices from a clean internal compass. But if you scrape beneath that idea just a little, you start to see the cracks. Because the truth is way messier and honestly a little disappointing at first. You weren't built to be alone. Not psychologically, not biologically, not historically. You were built for the crowd. I know, nobody likes to hear that. Especially now when everything's about individuality, branding. Be your own person. Think for yourself. And sure, those are great ideals. But evolution doesn't care about your Twitter bio, it cares about what worked, what survived. And what survived was the group, Because back then, alone meant dead. Period. You didn't outrun predators on your own. You didn't find enough food or fight off invaders or raise kids without a tribe. The humans who craved solitude, they didn't make it long enough to pass those preferences down. But the ones who synced, who merged, who adapted to the crowd's mood, fear, rhythm, they survived, and they passed that wiring down to you, to me. So when you find yourself blending into a group without meaning to, or going along with something just to keep the peace, or staying silent when your gut wants to speak, it's not just culture, it's code. It's your brain doing what it was designed to do, protect you from exile. Because exile used to mean death. Now it just means discomfort, maybe embarrassment. But your brain doesn't know the difference. It still fires the same alarms, still sends the same signals. That tension in your chest when you're about to say something unpopular, that's your nervous system going, are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure? And sometimes, yeah, you push through, you speak anyway, but often you don't. And I don't think that makes you a coward. I think it makes you human. It's weird, right? This thing we call a self is so vulnerable to context. You feel like the same person across time and space, but even small shifts, a new setting, a new crowd, can reshape your tone, your posture, your thoughts. Because your self isn't fixed. It's not a statue, it's a loop, a feedback system. Always responding to who's around, what they expect, what's rewarded, what's punished. The real you might not even exist in a vacuum. That doesn't mean you're fake or empty. It just means identity was never meant to be solo. But that raises the question, if we were built to belong, where does that leave the idea of independence? Of integrity? Of knowing who we are even when no one's watching? That's the paradox. Because both are true. You need the group, and the group will always shape you. But if you never step outside that influence, never examine it, then your life becomes a performance, not a lie, just rehearsed. And honestly, most people are okay with that. It's easier, comforting, predictable. But if you're still listening to this, maybe you're not like most people. Maybe part of you feels it, that tug, that question that doesn't go away. Is this really me, or just a version that gets applause? That question, it's not weakness, it's signal. It's the part of your brain that still remembers how to be alone, even if just for a second, long enough to listen for a different rhythm. Because yes, you were designed for the crowd. But you weren't only designed for it, you also have this other thing. This quiet, strange gift called metacognition. The ability to watch yourself, to notice your thoughts as they happen. And that wasn't about survival. That was something else, that's the part that lets you break pattern, that lets you stop and say, wait, why did I laugh just now? Why did I agree with that? Do I actually believe this? Most people never ask, or if they do, they push the question down. Because answering it might mean standing alone. And again, alone used to mean death. But now, it might mean clarity. Not moral superiority, not rebellion for its own sake. Just clarity. Knowing which parts of you were shaped by love, which by fear, which by tradition, which by necessity, and which still feel true even when no one's clapping. It's not about cutting yourself off from others. That's not the goal. You'll always need connection. We all do. But the trick, the tightrope walk, is staying connected without being erased. That means noticing when you shift, when your voice changes, when your posture softens or hardens depending on who's in the room. Not judging it, just watching. It means catching those moments where you want to speak but hesitate, where your instincts say no but your mouth says yes, where you scroll past something and feel something and still stay quiet. And maybe next time you don't. Maybe you pause, breathe, and ask, is this me? Or is this just the crowd moving through me? Sometimes the answer will scare you. Sometimes it'll free you. But at least it'll be yours. And maybe that's all we can really ask for. Not a pure identity. Not some perfect self untouched by influence. Just a little space. Enough to choose which voices get to stay and which ones you let go. Because the crowd will always be there. Always pulling, always humming in your bones. But so will you, if you remember to look. It's easy to think the damage happens all at once. That the big shifts, how we lose ourselves in crowds, how we bend to group pressure, how we mirror emotions we don't feel, are loud and obvious, a riot, a blackout, a public breakdown. But most of the time it doesn't happen like that. It happens quietly. It happens in meetings where you smile and nod at a decision that makes your stomach turn. It happens in friendships where you let a moment slide because you don't want to be the heavy one. Again. It happens in families where you bite your tongue for the 100th time because saying what you actually feel would ruin dinner. It happens online where your silence gets misread as agreement, where you post a half-truth because the whole one won't land well, where you scroll, and every scroll smooths down something sharp inside you, not because you're weak, but because you've learned that speaking, really speaking, carries a cost. And yeah, maybe you can afford that cost once, twice, but not every time. Not every room. So instead of resisting, you start adjusting. You soften the language. You drop the question. You dim the signal. 1 degree at a time. Until one day, the self you've been editing for comfort starts to feel like the only version left, and no one notices. That's what makes it so dangerous. Because no one ever pulls you aside and says, "Hey, I think you're losing yourself." The crowd doesn't tell you that. The crowd rewards your sinking. It smiles when you adapt. It claps when you hit the beat. So, you keep dancing, even when your legs are tired, even when the song isn't yours. And the consequences? They show up later. In moments where you realize you don't remember how you really felt about something, only how you were supposed to feel. In arguments with people you love, where your words don't sound like your own anymore. In late-night thoughts that feel too distant to be trusted. In the way your reflection looks at you, not with judgment, but with distance. Like even your own face is waiting for you to come back. It's not dramatic. It's erosion. A little less honesty here. A little more compromise there. And sometimes, yeah, it's necessary. Relationships need compromise. Societies need harmony. But there's a line. And the problem is, it moves. Each time you cross it, it moves just a little farther. And eventually, you're nowhere near where you started. But because you crossed the line gradually, you barely felt it happen. That's what I mean by quiet consequences. You're still functioning, you're still showing up. But something about you, some solid core, is thinner. Like too much light's been let in, and now you can't tell where you end and the world begins. And here's the kicker. The world will applaud you for this. It will call you agreeable, mature, easy to work with. But deep down, something in you will ache. Not loudly, just enough. Enough to make you pause before speaking. Enough to make you flinch when you're alone. Enough to feel like you're performing even when no one's watching. And the weirdest part? Sometimes you'll miss the crowd, even knowing all this. Because the crowd gave you something too. A place, a rhythm, a role. And without it, you're left with the raw sound of your own thoughts. Which, let's be honest, isn't always comforting. It's quieter, less certain. It doesn't have the dopamine of approval, the rush of belonging. It doesn't fill your notifications. It just sits there. Bare, honest, sometimes confused, sometimes ugly, but also real. And maybe that's the trade. You can't have both. Not all the way. You can't be fully synced and fully you. Not at the same time. So you choose, moment by moment. Sometimes the crowd, sometimes the self. But you choose. And that's the difference. Because when you don't choose, when you just drift, you give the crowd permission to write your story for you. And it will. With your voice, your face, your feed, your body. It will write it so smoothly that you'll read it back and swear you wrote it yourself. Unless you stop. Not forever. Just long enough to ask, is this who I want to be? Is this the rhythm I believe in? Do I even remember my own? You don't need a revolution, you just need a moment. To remember that even if you were designed for the crowd, you weren't meant to disappear inside it. You were meant to dance at the edge of it. Close enough to feel the heat, far enough to feel the air. You know that feeling after everyone leaves? The silence that comes when the crowd fades, the notifications stop, the laughter's gone quiet, and the air finally settles? That's the moment I'm talking about. When it's just you again. And your breath feels louder than it should. Your thoughts a little raw. You sit with the weight of it, whatever it was, and you try to figure out if you actually meant half the things you said, or if you were just playing the part. I think we all have those moments, but we rush past them. Too tired. Too full. or too afraid of what we might notice. Because reflection isn't clean. It's not some polished insight at the end of a chapter. It's murky, sticky, unfinished. You sit there rewinding flashes of faces, words, choices, and they don't always line up. You thought you were certain at the time, but now it feels like someone else was holding the wheel for a while. And maybe they were. Maybe that's just the cost of being human. You drift, you adapt, you blend, you forget the edges of yourself for a while, and sometimes it's not even a mistake. It's survival. It's comfort. But at some point, you come back. Or you don't. And if you do, if you're lucky enough to catch that moment, you don't rush to rebuild. You don't scramble to recover the exact version of yourself you had before. You just sit, you breathe, and you watch the parts of you that remained, the quiet opinions that didn't budge, the discomfort you felt, even if you didn't speak it, the weird laugh that still escaped when no one else got the joke, the thought that kept tugging at your sleeve, whispering, "This isn't you," even if you ignored it. Those are the threads. That's where you begin again. Not with defiance, not with some loud declaration that you've found your truth, just with awareness. A little more awareness than last time. That's the whole game. Not perfection, not total immunity to the pull of the crowd. Just better noticing, quicker returns, shorter gaps between losing yourself and remembering again. You might still follow the crowd sometimes. You might still get swept up. You might still say yes when you mean maybe, or nothing when you mean no. But now you'll feel it. That's the shift. It won't make you invincible, but it'll make you present. And that presence, that's the part no crowd can steal. It's yours. Quiet, unimpressive, maybe even a little boring. But it's you. And at the end of the day, when the noise dies down and the roles fall off and the crowd turns back into individuals again, that's who you come home to. So don't forget how to find that person. Not every time, just more often than you don't.